Vivian Whitlock pressed one perfectly gloved finger against Mara's chest right there, in front of the hired hands loading barrels into the cellar, and said it like she was commenting on the weather. "You will enter through the back. You will remain in the kitchen. And if any of my guests happen to see you," she paused, her eyes moving slowly down Mara's body, the way a person looks at furniture, they're deciding whether to throw out well. "Let's just say a woman of your dimensions tends to spoil an appetite." Mara Bellamy stood very still. She had flour on her sleeve and $40 to her name and a leaking roof waiting for her 12 miles away. She stood still, and she did not say a single word. If you've ever been told that you were too much, too big, too poor, too ordinary to be seen, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens in that banquet hall will leave you breathless. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me the city or country where you're watching. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Mara had not planned on being a cook. She had not planned on being a widow at 31 either, but the Wyoming prairie had its own ideas about what a woman's life was supposed to look like, and most of those ideas were brutal. Her husband, Thomas Bellamy, died on a February morning so cold that the ground refused to receive him properly for 11 days. He was not a bad man. He was not a remarkable man. Either he drank a little more than he should have, and talked a little less than Mara needed, but he was hers. And when he was gone, the silence in the house on those 40 acres of hard Wyoming soil became something physical, something she had to push through every morning just to get her feet on the floor. The settlement people at Red Creek Crossing came to the burial. They brought covered dishes and quiet voices, and the particular kind of sympathy that lasts about 3 weeks before it turns into something closer to inconvenience. Mara noticed when the visits stopped. She noticed when the sympathy shifted slowly into the kind of thing people don't say out loud, just carry around in their expressions when they see you coming. She was 29 when she married Thomas. She had never been small, not as a girl, not as a young woman, and certainly not by the time she was standing at her husband's grave in a black dress that pulled at the seams because she hadn't bought anything new in 2 years. People in Red Creek Crossing were not unkind exactly. They were just the particular kind of ordinary that sees a heavy woman and stops looking, as if the body itself answered every other question a person might have. They did not see her hands wide and capable and extraordinary in ways she was only beginning to understand. They did not see her mind precise, patient, able to hold 12 variables at once when she was building a recipe the way another person might build a house. They saw the size of her, measured her accordingly, and moved on. Mara spent the first year after Thomas's death learning exactly how much that cost her. She applied for work at the general store. Luther Haynes told her, with genuine regret in his voice, that he needed someone quick on her feet. She applied at the schoolhouse, but the position had already been filled. She offered to take in washing. She did take in washing. For a while, 3 families' worth of laundry hauled through her kitchen every Monday, her hands cracked and bleeding by Thursday. 40 cents a week per household. Kept her alive. It kept the roof from becoming someone else's problem. It did not keep the roof from leaking. It was her mother's recipe book that changed things. The book itself was nothing impressive. A water-stained journal with a cracked spine, and her mother's handwriting inside, small and careful, the way poor women write when paper is expensive. Cornbread, biscuits, a particular method for sourdough starter that her mother had brought from Georgia and that Mara had been maintaining with varying degrees of success for 6 years. She made a batch of bread one March morning, not for anyone, just because she needed to do something with her hands that wasn't washing or crying, and left 2 extra loaves on her windowsill because the oven was hot, and she might as well. Old Della Rouser came up the road at noon and smelled it from 40 feet away. "Lord above," Della said, leaning over the fence. "What in the name of sense is that smell?" "Bread," Mara said. Della bought both loaves for a nickel each. She came back the following Thursday with her neighbor. By June, Mara was selling bread twice a week. By August, she had added pies rhubarb first, then apple, then a blackberry that made the Reverend Holt's wife cry at the county fair because it tasted like her grandmother's kitchen in Tennessee. Mara did not win a ribbon at that fair. She wasn't entered, but Mrs. Holt ordered 4 pies the following week, and that was worth more than any ribbon. She wasn't thriving, but she wasn't drowning anymore either. There's a particular kind of life that lives between those two things, the daily arithmetic of survival, and Mara had become very good at it. She expanded into hearty meals for the logging camp when Hanson's crew needed someone to feed 18 men 3 times a day for 6 weeks. She drove a wagon 12 miles in the dark to deliver biscuits and beef stew before sunrise. Came back with her back aching and her wheels caked in mud, and enough money to buy 2 new laying hens and a decent saw for the loose boards on her porch. She did not celebrate. She fixed the porch, bought the hens, and started planning the next week. This is what 3 years of survival had made her. Someone who planned the next week before the current one had finished. Someone who slept lightly. Someone who knew exactly how many dollars she needed to make it to the following month and woke at 4 in the morning calculating whether she was going to get there. She was not bitter. That is important. She had no time to be bitter. She was simply precise about reality in a way that only poverty teaches. Silas Mercer's name came to her through Clara Dunn, who heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who'd been told by the county clerk that the Mercer Ranch was hosting the largest wedding celebrations Red Creek Crossings had seen in 20 years. 200 guests. A 3-day celebration, and Silas Mercer, who owned more land than most men in the territory had ever touched with their hands, was apparently willing to pay real money for someone who could actually cook. The number Clara whispered was enough to make Mara set down the rolling pin she was holding. $40. One job. $40. Her roof had been leaking since October. Her horse, Old Pepper, needed shoes she kept putting off. The flour she bought in bulk was almost gone, and the price had gone up twice in the past year. $40 was not a fortune. But it was the difference between this fragile arithmetic she'd been running for 3 years and something that might actually hold. She sent a letter to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday. By Thursday, a writer came back with a reply in clean, businesslike handwriting. Come Friday. Discuss details. S. Mercer. She drove herself out to the Mercer property in the wagon with Pepper, who was slow, and had opinions about mud. The ranch was everything she'd been told. It was a main house big enough to swallow her entire homestead twice over, outbuildings that were newer and sturdier than anything in the crossing, land that stretched. So far she stopped being able to make out the fence line. Silas Mercer met her in front of the house. She had expected someone older. He wasn't maybe 38, 40, with the kind of face that son and work leave interesting but not ravaged. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he's actually trying to read, and that alone was enough to make her slightly suspicious. Most men in the territory looked at her once and decided what they were seeing. Miss Bellamy, he said. Mr. Mercer, she said, come in. I'll have coffee brought. The conversation was direct, which she appreciated. He needed a cook to manage the wedding feast, 4 courses, a wedding cake, bread and pastry for 3 days, coordination of the serving staff, and supervision of 2 kitchen helpers he'd already hired from town. The celebration was in 2 weeks. He had tried and failed to find someone in the county seat. Someone had recommended her name. Who? She asked. He almost smiled. Reverend Holt's wife. Mara thought about Mrs. Holt crying over the blackberry pie and felt something warm move through her chest. What's the payment? She said, because she had learned not to circle around the only question that mattered. $35 for the week, he said, and 5 more upon completion if everything runs correctly. $40, exactly. I'll need a written agreement, she said, terms of work, hours, kitchen access, and final authority over the menu. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, something closer to recalibration. Like she had answered a question he hadn't asked yet. I can have that drawn by Monday, he said. She told him she'd think about it over the weekend. She had already decided. But she'd learned that agreeing too quickly costs you something you can't always name. She drove home in the dark with Pepper plodding through the ruts in the road, and she sat at her kitchen table after supper and wrote out the full menu by lamplight, what she'd need, what it would cost, what she'd have to begin preparing a full 10 days in advance to make a 3-tier cake at that scale work the way she needed it to. She'd never made a wedding cake that large. She'd made plenty of cakes. She'd made cakes for funerals and county fairs, and one very ambitious birthday celebration for the logging camp foreman's mother-in-law. She knew the principles. She could work through the scale. Do this. The agreement came Monday as promised. She read every line. She amended 2 clauses about kitchen authority and sent it back. He accepted the amendments without argument, which told her something she filed carefully away. She arrived at the Mercer Ranch the following Wednesday morning with her own knives, her own apron, her mother's recipe book, and enough sourdough starter to feed 200 people bread that tasted like it had been made by someone who understood why bread matters. Kitchen was large and well equipped. She walked through it slowly, checking what she had and what she needed, making lists in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Vivian Whitlock arrived that same afternoon. Mara heard her before she saw her voices in the entry hall, bright and particular in the way of women, who have learned that sound carries differently when you're beautiful and accustomed to being received. She heard Silas's voice lower in laughter. She did not go to look. She had bread to begin. It was 30 minutes later that the kitchen door opened, and Vivian walked in with 2 other women close behind her. And the shift in the room was immediate and complete, the kind of shift that happens when someone who expects to command a space enters it. Vivian Whitlock was 24. She had the kind of looks that frontier life usually corroded over time, but she was young enough that it hadn't started yet. Dark hair and pale skin, and a dress that had no business being in a working kitchen. She looked at Mara the way women like her look at staff, briefly and entirely. "You're the cook," she said. "I'm the cook," Mara agreed. Vivian walked along the work table, running one finger across the edge as if inspecting for dust. "I've made a few changes to the menu," she said. "Nothing significant. I prefer the soup without turnips are so heavy, and I'd like the 3rd course to lead with the fish rather than the roast. And the cake," she paused, looking at Mara's notebook. "I want it 3 tiers, obviously. White icing. Nothing rustic." Mara set down the spoon she was holding. "The agreement Mr. Mercer and I signed gives me final authority over the menu," she said. "If you'd like to discuss changes, I'm happy to do that, but I won't be modifying the core courses. Timing of a meal that size requires a fixed plan." Something very cold moved through Vivian's expression. "I'm the bride," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Mara said. The silence stretched. "The turnips are staying," Mara said. "Balance the broth. Without them, the soup will be too thin for a November evening." One of the women behind Vivian made a small, surprised sound. Vivian smiled the specific kind of smile that doesn't involve warmth and turned and walked out of the kitchen. Mara picked up her spoon. Her hands were completely steady, but her heart was doing something uncomfortable, and she recognized the feeling for exactly what it was, not fear. Something older and harder than fear. The knowledge that a woman who smiles like that doesn't let things go. She stores them, and she waits. The first 3 days went harder than Mara expected, not because the work was beyond her, but because the work and the watching were happening simultaneously. Vivienne did not return to the kitchen, but she sent her opinion through the 2 hired helpers. Small adjustments, comments passed along secondhand, little redirections that Mara ignored almost entirely because she recognized them for what they were. She was up before 4 every morning. She set bread to proof in the cool back room, prepared stocks that needed to reduce slowly, began the complex layered process of building the cake tiers without rushing the structure. She had help Agnes, who was quiet and fast and didn't need instructions repeated, and a boy named Clement, who was 15 in earnest and dropped things with alarming regularity. On the fourth day, Silas came into the kitchen. He didn't announce himself, didn't make noise about it, just came through the back door and stood near the entrance, looking at the organized chaos of a kitchen in full production. Mara noticed him after a moment and kept working. "Is there something you need?" she asked. "No," he said. "I wanted to see how it was going." "Going," she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. She didn't perform for the attention. She had too much to do, but she was aware of him in the particular way. You're aware of someone who is actually looking, rather than just seeing. "Turnips," he said. Eventually, she told me about the turnips. Mara did not look up from the dough she was working. "The turnips are staying," she said. "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice, not amusement, not approval, just something plain and direct that made her stop for just 1 second and look at him. He wasn't smiling. He looked tired, actually. She went back to the dough. "Is there anything you need from me?" he asked. "More butter," she said. "And if your cellar has more salt pork, I could use another side for the bean course." He nodded. "I'll have it brought." He left without further ceremony. Mara stood at the work table for a moment after he'd gone, her hands still in the dough, and thought about nothing in particular. Then she went back to work. On the 5th day, Vivienne came to the kitchen again. This time she came alone, and she did not walk along the work table. She stood in the doorway and looked at Mara with the particular steadiness of someone who has been composing what she wants to say. "I need you to understand something," Vivienne said. "My guests, the people coming to this wedding, they are people of quality. They come from good families. They are not accustomed to," she paused, and her gaze moved, deliberately, over Mara's body, certain kinds of presentation. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. She made herself breathe evenly. "You will not come into the banquet hall," Vivienne said. "You will not be introduced to guests. You will remain in the kitchen during the celebration, and you will use the back entrance for anything you need to bring in or out. Do you understand me?" Mara looked at her, looked at the specific quality of contempt in Vivienne's expression, not the wild kind, but the composed kind, which is worse because it means the person has sat with it long enough to make peace with it. "Is Mr. Mercer aware of this instruction?" Mara asked. "This is my wedding," Vivienne said. "That's not what I asked," Mara said. Something flickered just briefly in Vivienne's expression. "It is my wedding," she repeated, "and if you want your payment at the end of this, you will stay where I put you." She left. Agnes was at the far end of the kitchen, very carefully not looking up from the beans she was sorting. Clement was staring at the floor. Mara stood very still for a moment. Then she crossed to the stove, checked the temperature, and adjusted the flue. She had 2 more days of work to do. She was going to do them. She was going to be paid. And then she was going to drive home to her 40 acres in the dark, sit down at her kitchen table, and figure out how she felt about all of this, in the quiet where no one could see her doing it. She reached for the next pan. She kept moving. The pan she reached for that evening was heavier than she remembered, or maybe her arms were just tired. Mara didn't sleep well that 5th night. She lay on the narrow cot she'd been given in the back room, off the kitchen, a courtesy Silas had offered. Since driving 12 miles home and back each morning would have cost her 2 hours she couldn't afford, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. The wind off the Wyoming flats came through the walls in a way that reminded her of her own house, which was both comforting and not. She thought about what Vivienne had said. Not the words exactly, but the tone of them, the complete assurance in the woman's voice, as if she were simply describing the arrangement of furniture. As if Mara's place in this situation had been decided long before Mara arrived, and the only variable was whether Mara would make it easy or difficult. She thought about the $40. She thought about Pepper's shoes and the leaking roof and the price of flour. Then she stopped thinking about any of it and made herself go to sleep, because she had to be up in 4 hours. And the cake tiers needed to come out of the cold room and be assessed for any settlings before she started icing work. She was up at 3:40. The kitchen at that hour had a particular quality she had come to appreciate over the years, the specific silence of a large space before anyone else has claimed it for the day. She built the fire in the main stove before the sky had started to lighten, put the coffee on, and stood for a moment, with her hands pressed flat against the work table, feeling the cool solidity of the wood under her palms. 6 days in. The wedding was Saturday. It was now Wednesday before dawn. She had time, not comfortable time, not the kind of time where a person could afford to make mistakes and circle back, but the real working kind, where if you moved correctly and didn't waste anything, you would get where you needed to go. She went to the cold room and checked the cake tiers. The bottom tier had done something she didn't love, a slight list to the left side, barely visible, but there, kind of thing that wouldn't matter in a smaller cake, but in a 3-tier structure could become a problem by the time the second and third tiers went on. Stood looking at it in the dim light of the single lantern she'd brought in, pressing her fingers very gently against the edge to assess the density. Not a collapse, not even close. But she was going to have to compensate in the filling layer, add a slight correction to the left side before she stacked the second tier, and monitor it through the morning. She went back to the kitchen and started the bread dough. Agnes arrived at 6, coming through the back door with her coat still on and her breath making small clouds in the kitchen air. She was a compact woman, somewhere in her 40s, gray, starting at her temples, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, but noticed everything. She had been hired by Silas to help in the kitchen, and in 5 days she and Mara had arrived at an efficient understanding of each other that required very little conversation to maintain. Agnes looked at Mara's face and then at the notebook open on the work table. "Problem?" she asked. "Bottom tier drifted," Mara said. "I'll handle it this morning. I need you to start the beef stock. We let it go an extra hour yesterday, and it's perfect. I don't want to lose it. Strain it while I'm doing the cake, and don't let Clement near the stove." "He burned his hand again yesterday," Agnes said. "I know. I saw him do it. He does the same thing every time he grabs without looking." "He means well." "He does," Mara agreed. "Keep him on bread and vegetable prep. He's actually good with the knife when he pays attention." Agnes was already tying her apron. She did not say anything more about it, which was one of the things Mara valued most about her. Clement arrived at 7, still managing to knock the door slightly harder than necessary against the frame, which was simply who he was. He was 15 and large, in the way of boys, who were still growing into themselves, with ears that stuck out and a fundamental goodwill that no amount of kitchen catastrophe had yet diminished. He looked at Mara's notebook on the work table, with the expression of a person who has learned that the notebook means serious business. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Turnips," she said. "Half-inch dice. Uniform. If they're not uniform, they don't cook evenly and the soup will be wrong." He nodded and went to find the turnips without further comment, which was progress. Mara went back to the cold room with her tools. The next 2 hours were the kind of work she didn't enjoy, explaining to people who hadn't done it, because it sounded simple from the outside, adjusting a cake, building a filling layer, correcting a structural problem, and was actually 45 minutes of concentrated precision, during which she didn't let herself think about anything except the angle of the tier and the density of filling, and whether the correction was holding. She checked it 3 times before she was satisfied. Then she started the second tier's icing foundation and left it to set while she went back to manage the bread. The morning moved the way. Good, working mornings move not easily, exactly, but with that particular momentum where each task connects to the next one, and you don't have to decide what you're doing, because you already know. Marza was aware of the time in her body rather than in her head the way she always was when she was deep in a production this large. Almost didn't hear the kitchen door open just before 9. It was one of Vivienne's companions from the first day, a slender woman named Harriet, with sharp eyes and a way of standing in doorways that suggested she was perpetually deciding whether a room was worth entering. She came in carrying a folded piece of paper and held it out to Mara across the work table with the specific delicacy of someone who doesn't want to get too close to flour. From Miss Whitlock, she said. Mara wiped her hands and took the paper. It was a handwritten list. 6 items, all changes to the menu. Not suggestions, changes. Written in the decisive hand of someone who expected them to be implemented. Turnips again, the soup portion size, the arrangement of the second course. And at the bottom, underlined, the cake will have decorative flowers, white, not yellow. Arrange for delivery of fresh flowers Friday morning. Mara read it twice. She set it down on the work table. Harriet was watching her, with the careful attention of someone who had been sent to gauge her reaction and report back. Please tell Miss Whitlock, Mara said, that I've received her note. I'll review what's feasible and send a response this afternoon. Harriet waited a beat, as if she'd expected something more dramatic. Then she nodded and left. Agnes was watching from across the kitchen. Clement was very focused on his turnips. Mara folded the note and put it in her apron pocket. She was not going to implement any of it. The menu was set, the timeline was fixed, and changing the cake decoration to include fresh flowers, delivered the morning of a November wedding in Wyoming, was the kind of idea that came from someone who had never had to source fresh flowers in November in Wyoming. But she was also not going to respond with that explanation in a written note that Vivienne could use as evidence of insubordination. She had learned over 3 years of navigating the various personalities of customers who hired her that the most effective response to a person trying to pull your work out from under you was to be extremely polite and extremely unmovable simultaneously. She went back to the bread. At noon, when she stopped to eat a quick bowl of stock and a heel of the morning's bread, standing at the work table, because sitting down in the middle of a workday was a luxury she hadn't practiced in years, Silas came into the kitchen again. He had a habit of coming in through the back. She'd noticed, not making an announcement of it, just arriving. He looked at the kitchen, the bread cooling on the rack, the stock simmering, the cake components in various stages of progress, visible through the cold room door. And then he looked at Mara. Harriet told me there was a note, he said. She delivered it, Mara said. I told her I'd review what was feasible. What is feasible, he said. None of it, Mara said. She picked up her spoon and ate a mouthful of stock. The menu is fixed for reasons that are structural, not preferential. Changing the second course arrangement at this stage means rebuilding the timing sequence for the entire meal, which means the roast comes out wrong, which means 200 people eat dry beef at your wedding. Fresh flowers in November, she paused, choosing her words. I'd have to send someone 40 miles to find them, and they'd be half dead by Saturday morning regardless. The cake will be beautiful without them. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'll speak to Vivienne, he said. You don't have to do that, Mara said. I'll send a response this afternoon. Politely. He looked at her. Not the assessing's look from their first meeting, something quieter than that. Something that she couldn't quite categorize, and therefore set aside. Mrs. Bellamy, he said, how is the cake actually going? And she almost laughed. The bottom tier listed this morning, she said. I corrected it. It'll be fine. But it wasn't fine this morning? It was a problem this morning, she said. Now it's handled. That's how kitchens work. He nodded slowly. I'll have the flowers dropped from the list, he said. The rest of it. I'll handle the rest of it, she said. He left. Mara ate the rest of her stock. Agnes from across the room said nothing, but there was something almost like a smile at the corner of her mouth, there and gone. The note Mara sent back that afternoon was 6 sentences long and addressed the menu changes one by one with specific logistical explanations, not defiance, just professional reasoning. She had learned that professional reasoning was very hard to argue with directly because it removed the personal from the equation. You couldn't fight someone who was simply explaining the physics of roasting beef. The response from Vivienne was silence, which was in its own way a kind of answer. Thursday came, and the kitchen moved faster. The bread production for 3 days had to be calculated precisely. Some loaves baked fresh the morning of, others prepared ahead and managed carefully so they didn't lose texture. Mara had a system. She had written it out in the notebook 4 times until it was right, and she ran Agnes and Clement through it twice so they could execute without her having to explain in the middle of service. The roast beef, 8 of them, the largest cuts she'd ever managed at once, needed to go into the oven in stages. Friday morning, timed so they came to table in sequence and stayed hot through the serving. She had mapped the timing to the minute. She had a small fear in her stomach about the oven's temperament. Every oven had one. A hot spot or a cool corner or a tendency to surge when the firewood was too green, and she'd spent the first 2 days learning this particular oven's personality before she trusted it with anything critical. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the old iron stove with the warped left burner, how you learned to compensate, how you stopped fighting the tool and started working with what it actually was. She spent Thursday afternoon building the filling layers for the second and third cake tiers, then stacking them with the focused attention of someone doing surgery. Clement watched from a respectful distance, which she appreciated. "How do you know how much is enough?" he said, watching her apply the filling with a flat knife, each pass measured and deliberate. "Experience," she said, "and before experience, failure." "How many times did you fail before you got it right?" "Often enough to know what right looks like," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother makes cake," he said, "but it always sinks in the middle." "Her oven runs hot on the bottom," Mara said. "Tell her to put a pan of water on the lower rack. It slows the bottom heat." He looked at her like she'd said something extraordinary. "That's all," he said. "Most problems have simple answers," she said. "The hard part is knowing which problem you actually have." She was not trying to teach him anything. She was just talking while she worked. But she noticed later, when she went to check on the roast prep, Clement was moving through the vegetable station with more care than he usually managed, and she filed that away without comment. Thursday evening, she was alone in the kitchen after Agnes and Clement had gone, doing a final check on everything: the cold room, the stove, the bread that was proofing overnight, when she heard voices from the hallway beyond the kitchen door. Not the main hall, the side passage that ran behind the dining room. 2 voices. She wasn't trying to listen, but the kitchen was quiet, and the walls in the Mercer house were not as thick as their appearance suggested. Vivienne's voice, first precise, controlled, but with an edge in it that told Mara she was not as composed as she intended to sound. "I simply think it reflects poorly." A woman like that, with her presentation being associated with our celebration. People will talk about what they see and what they see when they come into this kitchen. Silas's voice. Quieter, and Mara had to work to make it out. "They won't come into the kitchen, Vivienne. She could be seen anywhere, going in and out, moving through the... She works before most guests are awake," Silas said, "and she is the most competent person this inn's building." Silence. "That," Vivienne said, "is an extraordinary thing to say." "It's accurate," Silas said. Mara stood very still in her kitchen. She did not feel vindicated. Exactly. She felt something more complicated, the specific discomfort of being discussed, even positively, as if her presence were a logistical consideration rather than a human fact. But she also heard what he'd said plainly, without decoration, and she put it in the same place. She put other things that needed to be sorted later, when she had time for it. She went to bed at 10. She was up again at 3:30. Friday was the hardest day. Not because anything went catastrophically wrong. Nothing did. Not exactly, but because the volume and complexity of the work came together in a way that required her to make a dozen small decisions every hour, each one affecting the next, with no margin for hesitation. The roasts went in at 4 a.m. in rotating batches. Bread came out in the first shift and went on the cooling racks. Then the second shift went in. The soup went on the main stove at 6 and had to be monitored constantly because the Mercer oven did have a surge problem with the firewood, and she'd learned that the hard way on Tuesday when a lesser stock had scorched. Agnes worked beside her without being told what to do, just looked at Mara's face and the notebook and moved accordingly. Clement was steady in a way he hadn't been at the beginning of the week, as if the accumulated pressure had actually organized instead of scattering him. He didn't drop anything all day. The cake went to its final assembly at noon. Mara did it herself, with Agnes holding the third tier from below while Mara guided it down onto the second with the focus of someone landing something fragile from a height. Port rods she'd cut and placed Thursday held. The tier settled level. She checked it from 3 angles, adjusted nothing, and stepped back. It was the largest cake she had ever made. It was not perfect. She could see the small variation in the icing on the lower left of the second tier, where she'd had to compensate for the drift. Slight thickness she'd hidden under a decorative border of piped icing that was imperfect but deliberate. She'd made it look like a choice. Nobody who hadn't built it would know. She stood and looked at it for 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. Then she went back to the roasts. By 4 in the afternoon, with the first guests arriving for the evening, gathering before the Saturday ceremony, the kitchen was running on a controlled chaos that Mara had anticipated and planned for. She'd staged the food in the order of service, briefed the 2 serving staff Silas had brought in from the county seat on exactly how each course was to be managed: temperature, presentation, timing between removes, and she stood at the center of her kitchen and watched it all moving, and thought that it was, objectively, going to be very good. Not perfect. The soup was slightly saltier than she'd intended, because Agnes had added a second measure by mistake, and they'd had to balance it forward with more vegetable stock, which meant it would be thinner than planned. One of the bread loaves from the third batch had darkened too fast on top, and she'd had to cut the dark crust away and substitute from the second batch, which meant she was 12 rolls short of her planned quantity and would have to supplement with the extra sourdough she'd baked as backup. These were recoveries, not failures. She knew the difference. Vivian came to the kitchen door at 5. She did not come inside. She stood in the doorway, in her evening dress, a deep burgundy that suited her, and looked at the organized scene before her, the food staged and ready, the cake visible through the open cold room door, Mara moving between stations, with Agnes and Clement bracketing the operation. Mara saw her. She did not stop moving. Vivian said nothing for a long moment. Then the cake. "Show me." Mara went to the cold room and stood aside so Vivian could see it. Vivian stepped into the cold room. She stood before the 3-tier cake in the dim light and looked at it without speaking. Mara watched her face. She saw it, the small flicker, there and gone. The involuntary thing that happens when a person encounters something better than they expected. Vivian's chin lifted slightly, the way people do when they are composing themselves. "Flowers," Vivian said finally. "There are no flowers," as Mara said. "Not in November. What's on the cake is what I could execute to a standard worth your celebration. If you find it insufficient, I'll note that objection for Mr. Mercer." Vivian looked at her. "It's sufficient," she said quietly. She walked out of the cold room without looking at Mara again. Mara stood in the cold for a moment after she'd gone, breathing the still air. Then she went back to work. The evening service was not her primary production. It was a smaller dinner for the family and close guests, 20 people rather than 200, but she ran it with the same precision because she had no other mode. The food went out correctly, came back clean, and the feedback that reached her through the serving staff was what she'd come to expect from good work. Not commentary, just empty plates. She cleaned the kitchen after the evening service with Agnes, and they worked in near silence for an hour, restoring order to the space, so it was ready for the 5 a.m. start the following morning. At 8:30, Agnes put on her coat. "Tomorrow's the day," Agnes said. "Tomorrow's the day," Mara agreed. "You should sleep." "I will." Agnes paused at the door. "The cake is something, Mrs. Bellamy," she said, not effusively, just plainly, the way Agnes said most things. "Functional," Mara said. Agnes made a sound that wasn't quite disagreement. Then she left. Mara sat down at the work table for the first time all day. She sat there for about 3 minutes, which was all she could spare, and she looked at the kitchen around her, the racks of bread, staged roasting pans, The notebook opened to Saturday's timeline, and she allowed herself, briefly, to acknowledge that she had built something real here, that the work of this week was not small work, that the planning and the execution and the managing of every problem that had come up the drifted tier, scorched stock, the menu interference, constant surveillance of a woman who wanted her invisible, had required something she could not easily name, but recognized as a combination of her mother's stubbornness and her own hard-won years of learning what she was capable of. She was not triumphant. There was too much left to do for triumph, but she was steady. She went to her cot at 9 and fell asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. At 3:50 a.m. on Saturday, she was back at the stove. The morning moved with the terrible speed of performance. Days not rushed, because rushing killed precision, but continuous, unbroken. Each task flowing into the next with no room to stop and assess. Agnes was there at 5:30, Clement at 6, and the three of them worked the kitchen like a machine that had finally, after 6 days, learned its own rhythms. The first roasts came out of the oven at 7, and were perfect or as close to it as she'd learned to expect. It meant the exterior was right, and the interior temperature was exactly where she needed it, and the resting time she'd planned would carry it to the table correctly. She checked the second batch, adjusted the flue, moved to the bread. By 9, she could feel in the quality of the air through the kitchen walls that the house was filling. Carriages arriving, voices multiplying in the distance, particular low hum of 200 people assembling for something that mattered to them. She did not look out. She had work to do. At 11, Silas came into the kitchen. He looked different, dressed properly for the celebration, cleaner than she'd seen him all week, and he looked at the organized production around him with an expression she couldn't entirely parse. Not quite the inspecting look. Something more personal. "It's almost time," he said. "I know," Mara said. "Is everything?" "It will be ready when it needs to be ready," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He stood there a moment longer than made complete sense. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it this week." Mara looked at him. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Exactly, it was genuine. She could tell. And genuine things always took her a moment longer to respond to than things she could argue with. "I'll have the food to table on time," she said. "That's what you paid for." He nodded. Something moved across his face that she didn't analyze. Then he left. The ceremony was held in the main hall at noon. Mara was in the kitchen. She heard the music faintly through the walls, something being played on a parlor organ, she thought. The sound reaching the kitchen as a kind of murmur rather than anything distinct. She heard the collective shift of 200 people settling into their seats. She pulled the third batch of roasts from the oven. She began staging the first course. She was not thinking about the ceremony. She was thinking about the timing of the soup and the temperature of the bread and the fact that the serving staff needed to be briefed again before the doors opened, because there was one among them, a young man named Foster, who'd been brought in from the county seat, who kept wanting to serve from the wrong side, and she'd corrected him twice and wasn't entirely confident he'd retained it. She corrected him a third time at 12:15, quietly and specifically, and he nodded with genuine attention, this time, which was something. 12:40, the hall doors opened. The service began. Mara worked the kitchen through it all, orchestrating the timing of each course, managing the temperature of the food that sat between the kitchen and the table, watching the plates come back and reading from the evidence of what was eaten and what wasn't, whether the service was landing the way it should. The first course came back almost entirely clean. The soup, the slightly thin soup, came back clean too, which told her the balance she'd achieved was working, or the guests were polite, and she preferred not to know which. The roasts went out at 1:30, and she stood at the kitchen door and watched Foster carry the first platter and thought, correctly, that he was going to serve from the wrong side. And she caught Agnes's eye, and Agnes was already moving. It was corrected before it happened. The cake went out at 3. She had prepared herself for this moment, she realized, without knowing she was doing it, the moment when the thing she'd spent the most of herself on moved out of her hands and into the world, where it would be received by people who would never know what it had cost to build it. She watched Agnes and Clement carry it out together slowly and carefully, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it go and felt nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary flatness that follows the completion of something very hard. The noise from the hall was distinct enough to reach her. Not words, just the collective sound of a large group of people encountering something that had stopped them. Then voices, rising, something that sounded like appreciation. Mara turned back to her kitchen. She began the cleanup. She could hear the celebration continuing toasts. It sounded like the kind of formal speaking that follows the meal at an event like this. She worked through the dishes and the pans with her back to the kitchen door, Agnes beside her, Clement doing the heavy hauling without complaint. And then the hall got quiet, not the quiet of a speech ending, the sudden, full quiet of a large room holding its breath. Mara's hands slowed on the pot she was scrubbing. She heard Vivienne's voice. She couldn't make out words, just tone bright, projecting, the voice of a woman performing for an audience. Laughter from the crowd, then more speaking, and the tone shifted, and something in it made Mara go still without knowing exactly why. She heard her own name, not clearly, but she heard the shape of it, the 2 syllables of Bellamy, and she heard the laughter that followed, and it was not the warm kind. She set down the pot. Agnes had gone very still too. Mara untied her apron. She folded it and set it on the work table. She looked at it. For a moment, the flower still worked into the fabric. The stain near the pocket from Thursday's stock. The frayed edge she'd mended twice, and would need to mend again. And then she moved toward the back door. She was not going to walk out into that hall. She was going to leave. Through the back. So she was going to collect what she was owed and go home to her 40 acres. And she was not going to let herself think, until she was well clear of this place, about the sound of her name said in that particular tone to a laughing room. She had her hand on the back door when she heard the hall door open, turned. Silas Mercer stood in the kitchen doorway. He was not moving toward her. He was just standing there, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that mixed anger and something harder, more deliberate, into a look that was entirely controlled. "Come with me," he said. "I'm leaving," Mara said. "Not yet," he said. Please, the please was what stopped her, not because she owed him anything, but because in 6 days she had not heard him say it before, and she had a feeling, the specific instinct of a woman who has learned to read situations with great accuracy, that what happened in the next few minutes was not going to be what she expected. She stood in her kitchen. He waited. After a moment that stretched long enough to feel like a decision, she walked toward the door. The hallway between the kitchen and the main hall was 12 steps long. Mara counted them without meaning, to the way a person counts things when their mind is trying to stay busy so the rest of them can catch up. The floor was polished wood that reflected the light from the wall sconces, and her boots made a sound on it that was louder than she would have preferred. She was aware of how she looked, flower still on her sleeve, the apron gone, but the apron's ghost still visible in the creases of her dress, her hair pulled back practically rather than with any consideration for the 200 people she was about to stand in front of. She had not planned for this. She had planned for most things. That was the thing about being the kind of woman she was, living the kind of life she'd lived. You developed a habit of planning because surprise was usually expensive, and she'd learned to keep the cost of things down wherever possible. But she had not planned for Silas to come to the kitchen door with that look on his face and that single quiet word. She walked the 12 steps. He pushed the hall door open and held it, and she stepped through. The noise hit her first, not loud, exactly. But the massed presence of 200 people in an enclosed space has a physical quality, a warmth and weight that hits the body before the ears fully register the details. Then her eyes adjusted to the light, which was brighter than the kitchen candles and lanterns along the walls. The afternoon sun coming through the high windows, and she saw the room. Tables arranged in long rows, the remnants of the meal still on them. The cake she'd sibilt now, sitting in its place of honor at the head table with a third of it already served. Guests turned in their chairs. She felt the collective movement of it, all those eyes redirecting. Vivienne was standing near the head table. She had been speaking. Mara had been right about the performance, right about the projection of voice, and she stopped when the door opened. The specific way she stopped told Mara that she'd been mid-sentence about something important, and the interruption had landed wrong. Vivienne's expression, when she saw who had come through the door with her new husband, did something that Mara would remember for a very long time. Not collapse, not quite. More like a very controlled structure encountering an unexpected load, a tightening, a recalibration happening in real time behind the eyes. Mara stopped walking when she was far enough into the room that the door had swung shut behind her. She was not in the center of the hall. She was not positioned for drama. She was simply standing in a room full of people who were all looking at her, and she kept her face arranged in the specific neutral that she'd spent 3 years developing, not submission, not defiance, just the steady, readable calm of a person who has decided not to give the room any more than it's already taken. Silas walked to a position beside the head table where the whole room could see him clearly, and he turned to face the assembled guests. The room was already quiet. It got quieter. "I owe everyone here a correction," he said. His voice was not loud. He was not performing. He was just speaking in the flat, carrying tone of a man accustomed to being heard in large spaces without raising his voice. And the room responded to it the way rooms respond to that kind of authority, by going completely still. "My wife spoke just now about the feast you've all enjoyed today." He paused. Not for effect. It felt more like he was choosing each thing carefully. She gave the credit for it to herself. "I need you to understand that is not accurate." Vivienne made a sound. It was small and quickly suppressed, but in a room that quiet it carried. Silas looked at Mara. "The woman who fed 200 people today is Mrs. Mara Bellamy," he said. "She arrived at this kitchen before 4 in the morning, every morning, for 7 days. She designed the menu, managed every course, built the cake you saw this afternoon, and solved every problem that came up. And there were problems, because that is how real work actually goes. She did all of it with less help than she should have had, and more interference than she should have had to deal with." He paused. "I want that to be known. I want her name said correctly in this room." He said it again. Mara Bellamy. 200 people were looking at her. Mara stood with her hands at her sides and her back straight, and she thought very specifically about the bottom tier that had listed to the left on Wednesday morning, about the corrective filling layer she'd applied with the flat knife, measured and deliberate, about the piped border that had hidden the evidence of the repair so cleanly that no one who hadn't built the thing would ever know. She thought about that because it was the kind of thought that kept a person from doing something uncontrolled, and she could feel the pressure of this moment in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with 3 years, of something she'd never let herself name, now suddenly finding a crack in the wall. Applause started near the back of the room. Not an explosion of it, more like rain beginning a few hands, then more, then the sound thickening and spreading until it was general and full, and the room was looking at her and clapping, and she stood in the middle of it and felt, with a clarity that she hadn't expected, absolutely nothing she could have predicted. Not joy exactly, not vindication, though it was partly that. Something raw, the specific, complicated ache of being seen by people who should have been looking all along, which is never as clean as the stories make it. She gave the room a single nod. That was all she could manage. She turned and walked back through the hall door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall, and the door closed and the sound of the applause still audible through it, muffled now, becoming something distant and strange. She breathed. She was aware that her hands were not entirely steady. Agnes was standing at the far end of the hallway. She had not been there before. She must have come out of the kitchen when the noise changed. She was looking at Mara with her coat already on and her quiet, reading expression. And she didn't say anything, and Mara didn't say anything, and that was correct. Mara pushed off from the wall. She went back into the kitchen and picked up the pot she'd set down when she heard her name said in that tone. In the hall, the wrong tone, the one that had made her hands stop on the scrubbing, and she started washing it. Her hands were steadier now than they'd been in the hallway. She didn't understand that exactly, but she accepted it. Agnes came in a few minutes later and picked up a dish towel without comment. They finished the cleanup in near silence. At some point, Mara didn't register exactly when the noise from the hall shifted from the broad sound of celebration to something more specific. Voices raised. Not a fight, exactly, but the particular frequency of a room reorganizing around something unexpected. She heard movement, heels on the floor, a door she kept washing. It was not her business. It was 45 minutes later that Silas came back to the kitchen. He looked like a man who had just completed something difficult and was not certain what came after it. He stood inside the door and looked at Mara at the sink and at Agnes putting dishes on the rack and at Clement sweeping the far corner, and he put his hands in his coat pockets. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "If you're here about payment," Mara said. "I'm not finished yet. Another hour, probably. The serving pans are still." "That's not what I'm here about," he said. She turned and looked at him. He looked like he hadn't slept well in several days, which was a look she recognized because she'd been wearing it herself all week and had seen it in the kitchen window each morning. He looked like someone who had done a thing he knew needed doing and was now dealing with the full weight of what it had cost. "The engagement," he said, "it's ended." Mara set down the pan. She thought about Vivienne in the cold room doorway, looking at the cake. That involuntary flicker, the "it's sufficient," said quietly, like a concession. She thought about a woman who had made her life into a performance of a particular kind of perfection, and what it must feel like to have the audience turn. "I'm sorry," Mara said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly. Silas looked at her steadily. "Are you?" "It's a hard thing," Mara said. "Whatever she did tonight, it's still a hard thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You're more generous than she was to you," he said. "That's not generosity," Mara said. "That's just being honest about what hard things cost." She turned back to the pan. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. She could feel him there, the way you feel weather the particular pressure of a presence that has weight. Then he said, "I'll have your payment brought before you leave," and he went. Agnes was watching the dish rack with excessive attention. "Don't," Mara said. "I wasn't saying anything," Agnes said. "You were thinking it." "I was thinking," Agnes said carefully, "that today was a very unusual Saturday." Mara almost laughed. The sound that came out wasn't quite laughter, but it was in the neighborhood of it, and it surprised her enough that she put her hand up to her mouth. "Finished the rack," she said. Agnes finished the rack. They were done by 6. The kitchen was clean, the food staged correctly for the evening service that the remaining guests, those staying on the ranch, would require, and Mara had left Agnes a written list of instructions for the morning that covered every contingency she could identify. The Sunday service would be lighter, and Agnes could handle it without her. She had built the plan for it in her notebook 3 days ago. Collected her knives. She wrapped them in their cloth roll the way she always did, with the same care she gave them at home, because good knives were an investment, and careless transport was how you damaged the edge. She collected her mother's recipe book, her 2 aprons, one clean, one not, and the small notebook. She left the cold room key on the work table. The payment came through the kitchen in the hands of a man named Greer, who worked for Silas as his estate manager. He handed her an envelope. She opened it and counted the contents without apology, and it was correct. $40. She put it in her coat pocket. She went out to the barn where Pepper had been stabled all week, and she found him in better condition than she'd left him on Wednesday, which meant someone had been looking after him properly. She noted that with a satisfaction she chose not to examine too carefully. She hitched him to the wagon in the early dark. The ranch around her was quieter than it had been all day. The guests dispersing, the sound of the celebration retreating, and the night air was cold in the specific way of November in Wyoming. A cold that didn't threaten so much as simply exist, steady and indifferent. She climbed onto the wagon seat and sat for a moment. The $40 was in her pocket. The roof could be fixed. Pepper could be shod. The flour could be ordered. The work was done. He clucked to Pepper, and he started down the road, and she let herself breathe all the way out for the first time in 7 days. The drive home took an hour and 20 minutes. It was full dark by the time she turned up her own drive, and the house was cold because she'd banked the fire low before leaving Wednesday, and it had gone out sometime Thursday. She rebuilt it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had done it several thousand times, and she sat at her kitchen table while the room warmed, and she looked at her own 4 walls and her own stove, and her mother's recipe book sitting on the table where she'd set it down. She did not cry. She'd thought she might. The pressure she'd felt standing in that hall, the strange rawness of being applauded by people who had looked through her for 3 years, tiredness that had accumulated in her body over 7 days of working before sunrise. She thought some of that might come out when she got home to a room where no one was watching. Didn't, she just sat. She sat there until the room was warm enough, and then she made herself a cup of coffee and drank it standing at the stove, which was something she did sometimes when she was too tired to sit anymore. And she thought about nothing in particular. She went to bed at 9 and slept until 6, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep she'd had in 2 weeks. She woke up and made bread. The days that followed were ordinary, which was exactly what she needed. She had no outstanding orders for the week. She'd cleared her schedule before taking the Mercer job, knowing she'd be too depleted to manage both, and so she spent Monday cleaning the kitchen properly, inventorying her supplies, and assessing the state of various things she'd deferred while the week had consumed her. The roof was the priority. She hired Hector Sloan, who did carpentry work out of the crossing, and he came on Tuesday and spent the better part of 2 days replacing the worst of the shingles over the back bedroom and resealing the ridge. Cost $14. She paid him without the particular relief she'd expected, something between relief and just the ongoing management of arithmetic that was her life. On Wednesday, she rode Pepper to the farrier and had him shod. He was patient about it, in the way of old horses who have been shod many times and have decided the whole business is beneath their dignity, but manageable. She ordered flour. She ordered salt and sugar. She baked a batch of bread that she sold to the Crossing General Store on Thursday morning, and Luther Haynes, who had told her 3 years ago he needed someone quick on her feet, bought 6 loaves without meeting her eyes and gave her the correct change, and she put it in her apron pocket and drove home. She did not think much about the Mercer wedding. She thought about it the way you think about a bad tooth after it's been pulled, occasionally probing the space it used to occupy, feeling the absence, moving on. The Crossing was not a large community, and large events did not stay contained in them. Clara Dunn came by on Friday morning with 24 eggs and the specific expression of a woman who has been waiting for a socially acceptable reason to come by. "Everyone's talking," Clara said, at the kitchen table with her coffee, in the tone of someone delivering news she has been saving. "People usually are," Mara said. "About the wedding," Clara said. "About what happened. What he said in the hall, Silas Mercer, with all those guests. People are saying he stood up and said your name in front of everyone." Mara was quiet, and that the engagement. Clara paused, seeming to enjoy the pause more than was entirely polite, ended that night. "People know a lot," Mara said. "Well," Clara said, 200 guests go home and tell their families, and it's Wyoming. There's not much else to discuss in November." She looked at Mara over her coffee cup. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Mara said. "Were you frightened? Standing in that hall in front of all those people?" Marcia considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "I was tired," she said finally. "I'd been up since before 4. Mostly I was thinking about whether Foster had served from the correct side." Clara stared at her. "The serving side," Mara explained. "He kept wanting to serve from the left." It's supposed to be from the right. I'd corrected him 3 times. Clara burst out laughing, a real laugh, surprised out of her. You're a strange woman, Mara Bellamy, she said. Yes, Mara agreed. I know. Clara left the eggs and the conversation behind her, and Mara thought about the word strange and decided she didn't object to it. Strange was better than invisible. Strange at least meant you'd registered. The orders began arriving the following week. Not all at once, not the dramatic flood that stories tend to promise, but steadily, with a particular quality that told her something real was shifting. A note from the Hartwell family on Tuesday, requesting delivery of bread twice weekly at a price she'd never commanded before. A message from Mrs. Osgood, who ran the county judge's household, Judge Alderman, the most important household in the crossing, asking whether Mrs. Bellamy would be available to discuss an arrangement for regular meal preparation. She read that one twice. Judge Alderman's household, regular meals. The county judge whose approval or disapproval moved through the community like weather. Everything positioned in relation to it. She wrote back the same day. Yes, she was available to discuss it. She met with Mrs. Osgood the following Thursday in the judge's kitchen, which was twice the size of her own and had a newer stove. They discussed terms with the brisk efficiency of 2 women who had both been managing practical realities long enough to cut directly to what mattered. Mara quoted a weekly rate. Mrs. Osgood countered slightly lower. Mara came up halfway. They agreed. She drove home and sat at her table and wrote the numbers in her notebook. For the first time in 3 years, the arithmetic was not a matter of survival. It was a matter of growth, which was an entirely different kind of problem, and one she didn't yet know how to hold without some suspicion that it would collapse back into the familiar shape. She let it sit for a day before she let herself feel anything about it. What she felt when she got there was not joy, or not only joy. It was something more complicated, a fury that she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped recognizing it as fury, now shifting, now having somewhere to go. All those years of sufficient and almost and good enough for what it was, all those expressions that slid past her, all those mornings driving home in the dark with mud on her wheels and aching arms and 40 cents to her name. She felt the weight of all of it redistributing itself, and the redistribution was not gentle. She baked bread that evening. She didn't need to. She just needed to do something with her hands. She was in the middle of her 3rd batch when she heard a horse coming up her drive. She did not get many visitors in the evening. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out into the early dark and saw the shape of a rider she recognized by the way he sat, the particular straight but not stiff posture of a man who'd spent enough years on horseback to be unconscious of it. Silas Mercer dismounted at her fence. She watched him tie the horse. She went back to the bread. He knocked at her kitchen door. Not the front, the kitchen. She had not told him which door to use, but he'd made the right choice, and she was aware of that without wanting to give it too much significance. She opened the door. He looked like himself, not the wedding version, not dressed for anything, just a man in a working coat with the cold in his collar and his hat in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept entirely well since Saturday, which was, she thought, accurate. I should have come sooner, he said. Why, she said. He seemed slightly taken aback by that. To apologize, he said. For what, specifically, she said. He was quiet for a moment. For agreeing to it, he said. To the arrangement, the kitchen, the back door. I knew it was wrong when I agreed to it, and I agreed to it anyway, and I shouldn't have. Mara looked at him. She had thought about this conversation, not planned for it. Exactly, but thought about it. The way she thought about things she couldn't plan for. She had thought about what she would say when. And if Silas Mercer came to her door with his apology and his hat in his hand, and she had worked through several possible versions of herself, responding. None of them had felt entirely right. Come in, she said. The bread is almost done. He came into the kitchen and stood near the door while she went back to the oven. She didn't offer him coffee because she was in the middle of something, and it was not a social call, or it wasn't only a social call, and she wasn't going to perform a version of this that she didn't mean. You should have refused it when she asked. Mara said. Her back was to him, the back door. All of it. Yes, he said. You knew that. Yes, he said. She pulled the bread from the oven and set it on the rack. The smell filled the kitchen in the immediate, honest way of bread, no performance, just the thing itself. Why didn't you? She said. He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the bread on the rack, not at her. I told myself it was practical, he said, that the wedding was already complicated, and that she had strong feelings, and that the kitchen arrangement was professional and didn't need to mean anything beyond the logistics. He paused. I was wrong about what it meant. Yes, Mara said. I'm sorry, he said. It was simple and direct, and without any effort to be dramatic about it. Mara looked at him. Then she looked at the bread. Then she looked at him again. You said my name in front of 200 people, she said. Did. After letting her send me through the back door all week. Yes. Those aren't the same thing, she said. One doesn't cancel the other. I know, he said. I'm not looking for a replacement for whatever she was to you, Mara said. I'm not a solution to a problem your engagement left behind. That's what this is. She gestured at the general situation. The kitchen, his presence, the evening. Then I need you to be clear about it right now. Because I've spent 3 years being used for what I can provide, and I don't intend to make a habit of it. Something moved through his expression, not offense. She noted, which was worth noting. That's not why I'm here, he said. Then why are you here, she said. He looked at her. Because on Wednesday morning, he said, I came into the kitchen, and you were working before anyone else was awake. And you told me the bottom tier had listed, and you'd corrected it, and then you went back to work. And I went home that night and thought about that for 2 hours and couldn't entirely explain why. Mara stood very still. She thought about Wednesday morning, cold room, the flat knife, the careful angle of the correction. She hadn't thought anyone had seen that. It's not the cake, he said, and there was something slightly frustrated in it, as if he was aware that it sounded inadequate. It's I watched you for 7 days. I watched the way you worked, the way you handled problems, the way you refused to be reduced by someone who was actively trying to reduce you. And I was on the wrong side of that, and I need you to know I understand that. And I'm not here because he'd something from you. He paused. I'm here because I'd like to know you. If that's something you'd consider. The bread was cooling on the rack. The fire was doing what fires do. Mara looked at Silas Mercer, at the tiredness in him and the honesty, which were both real and which she had learned to identify with some reliability. She thought about what she knew of him, that he'd made the wrong choice and known it was wrong, that he'd corrected it publicly and at cost, that he'd come to her kitchen at the right door without being told, that he hadn't tried to dress any of this up into something easier to swallow. She was not moved in the way of stories. She was not swept. She was something more complicated, cautious, and aware of her own caution, and aware that caution was appropriate, and aware simultaneously that she had spent 3 years so focused on survival that she had stopped making any room at all for things that weren't arithmetic. She was not ready to make any decisions tonight. She wasn't sure what decisions there were to make. Sit down, she said. I'll make coffee. He sat down at her kitchen table, put the coffee on. They did not talk about the wedding or Vivian or the applause in the hall or the $40 or anything that had happened. They talked about the ranch. She asked him a question about the winter pasture rotation that she'd been genuinely curious about since she'd seen the state of South Field, and he answered it specifically and asked her a question about sourdough. Starter that was more informed than she'd expected, and she answered that. They drank coffee at her kitchen table for an hour. He thanked her and stood to go. At the door, he put his hat on and turned back once. The bread, he said. On the rack. What about it? It smells like... He stopped. Started again. It smells like something worth coming back for. He went out the door and down to his horse, and she stood in her doorway and watched him ride back down the drive into the dark. She was not smiling. She was thinking. She closed the door. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 coffee cups and the bread on the rack and the notebook open to her next week's orders. And she thought about the judge's household and the Hartwell account, and the flower she'd ordered, and the roof that was now, finally, fixed. She thought about what it meant to have spent 7 days building something extraordinary in a room where she wasn't supposed to exist, and to have had it recognized imperfectly, belatedly, at cost to someone else's comfort, and to be standing in her own kitchen with $40 earned, and a business that was, for the first time, beginning to feel like something real. She thought about the man who'd just sat at her table. She wasn't ready for any of it to be simple. She didn't think it was going to be simple. She washed the 2 coffee cups, put them on the rack beside the bread, and went to her notebook. She had 3 orders to plan for Monday, and she was not going to let a complicated evening derail the arithmetic that was, for the first time in 3 years, beginning to move in the right direction. The notebook she opened that Sunday evening had 3 orders listed for Monday, and she treated them the way she treated everything that mattered methodically, without sentiment, planning backward from the delivery time, to the prep time, to the moment she needed to be standing at the stove. She did not write Silas Mercer's name anywhere in the notebook. She was not ready to make him part of the arithmetic yet. The week that followed was the busiest she had managed since the logging camp job, but it was different in quality from that work. Different from most of the work she'd done in 3 years, actually. The logging camp had been survival, pure arithmetic. This felt like something with more variables in it, and variables were both promising and dangerous, and she was still deciding which one this was. Judge Alderman's household took her Mondays and Thursdays. The Hartwell account took Tuesday and Friday deliveries. 3 other orders had come in through the week. Following Clara Dunn's visit, word having moved through Red Creek Crossing with the particular speed of small community news, and she'd accepted 2 of them and declined the 3rd because the timing conflicted with the judge's kitchen, and she had learned the hard way that overcommitting was its own kind of failure. Mrs. Osgood, the judge's household manager, was a precise woman in her 60s with a talent for logistics and very little patience for deviation from agreed terms. Mara respected her immediately, and they got along because of it rather than in spite of it. The judge himself she saw, occasionally, a large man with an unhurried manner who nodded at her in the kitchen corridor on Thursdays, and once stopped to tell her that the soup on the previous Monday had been the best he'd eaten since his wife's. Mother was alive, and then walked on without waiting for a response. She considered that one of the more significant professional endorsements she'd received, and she put it in the same mental file where she kept Reverend Holt's wife and the blackberry pie. By the 3rd week of December, the arithmetic in her notebook had changed in a way she hadn't entirely let herself expect. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the weekly total had moved from the survival range, from the number she'd been calculating against for 3 years, the minimum required to keep the 40 acres and the horse and the flower, into territory she didn't have a practiced response to. She sat at the table one evening and added the column twice, because the first time she got a number that seemed implausible, and the second time she got the same number, and she set the pencil down and looked at it. It was not wealthy. She was not even comfortable in the way that people with real money are comfortable. But she was, for the first time since Thomas died, ahead. Not just even, not just treading ahead. She didn't celebrate. She ordered more salt pork and 2 better baking tins she'd been putting off for a year and a half. And she sat with the feeling of being ahead for one evening before she started thinking about what came next. What came next was the problem, and it arrived in her kitchen in the form of Silas Mercer on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the first time he'd come. He knocked at the kitchen door. She was not surprised he came back. She had thought he would, with the particular neutral certainty with which she thought about things she couldn't control, and had therefore decided not to waste energy predicting in detail. She had simply noted the probability and moved on. Came in without ceremony when she opened the door, sat at the table when she pointed at the chair, and accepted coffee when she set it in front of him. Crossing is talking, he said. The crossing is always talking, she said. What specifically? Your business, the judge's household, the Hartwell account. People are saying, you've taken on more work in 3 weeks than you've had all year. People know a surprising amount about my business for people who aren't my accountant, Mara said. Sss. He almost smiled. Mrs. Osgood mentioned it to Greer, he said, and Greer can't keep anything. Mara sat down across from him with her own coffee. Is there a point to this? She said. Or are you here to tell me things I already know? The point, he said, is that I was in the county seat last week, and I had lunch with a man named Aldous Whitby. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory who operated any kind of food business knew the name. Whitby ran the Territorial Hotel in the county seat, which was the largest establishment within 100 miles, and which hosted everything from mining company dinners to railroad surveyors, to the occasional government official passing through. It was the kind of place that operated at a scale she'd never worked at and had thought about in the abstract. The way you think about things you don't let yourself want directly. Kept her face arranged. What about him? She said. He's heard about the wedding, Silas said. He's heard about you. And he asked me. He asked me directly whether I thought Mara Bellamy would be interested in a conversation about a supply arrangement. Kitchen was quiet. The fire was doing what fires do. Ply arrangement, Mara said. Bread, pastry, pies. He wants to source from local producers for his dining room. He's been dealing with suppliers out of Cheyenne who are inconsistent and expensive, and he wants something he can depend on. He mentioned a weekly contract. Silas looked at her steadily. He asked me what I thought of your work. What did you tell him? I told him the truth, Silas said. I told him what I'd watched you produce in 7 days with an assistant and a 15-year-old who dropped things. Mara turned her coffee cup in her hands. He wants a meeting, Silas said. I told him I'd pass it along. That's all I'm doing. I'm not trying to arrange your business or tell you what to do with it. She believed him, which was part of the problem. She had gotten incrementally better at believing things he said, and she wasn't sure whether that was wisdom or carelessness. When does he want to meet? She said. He'll be in the crossing the first week of January, Silas said. He mentioned Thursday. She pulled her notebook across the table and looked at Thursday's column. Judge Alderman's kitchen in the morning. The Hartwell delivery in the afternoon. Tell him Friday morning, she said. 8 o'clock. Silas nodded. He stayed another 40 minutes. They talked about the South Field. Again, he had a question about whether cover cropping winter rye through the unused pasture sections made sense, or whether the soil in that part of his land was too alkaline. And she knew enough about the land around the crossing to have a considered opinion about it, and they worked through the quest together in the unhurried way of two people who both find practical problems genuinely interesting. She noticed, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had stopped waiting for him to become the version of himself she'd feared, the version that wanted something from her she hadn't offered, or wanted to arrange her into a shape that suited his life rather than her own. Kept not becoming that version. She kept noticing. He left at 8:30. She went back to her notebook. She was thinking about the Whitby meeting in the way she thought about things that could change the fundamental structure of her situation carefully. From multiple angles, trying to identify the variables she couldn't control before she committed to anything. Problem with the Whitby arrangement, if it materialized into something real, was scale. Kitchen could produce what it currently produced. Could not produce significantly more without significant investment, a larger oven, more preparation space, probably another person. She didn't have the capital for that. Not yet. She wrote those numbers down in a separate column and looked at them for a long time. Christmas came and went quietly. She spent it the way she'd spent the last 3 Christmases, working in the morning, because the Hartwell family wanted a holiday delivery, then alone in her own kitchen in the afternoon. She made a small roast chicken because it was Christmas, and she believed in the principle of the thing, and she ate it at her kitchen table with a book she'd been trying to finish since October, and managed 30 pages before she fell asleep in the chair. She woke at 9, went to bed properly, and was up at 4 to start the week. She had stopped thinking of holidays as events that required feeling a particular way. They were days. Some days were harder than others. This one was fine. Aldous Whitby arrived in Red Creek Crossing on a Thursday, which was not the day they'd arranged. But he sent word ahead and asked if Friday could become Thursday afternoon, and Mara rearranged the Hartwell delivery by 2 hours and told him Thursday at 3. He was a compact man in his 50s, well-dressed in the understated way of people who have money they've had long enough to stop performing it. He came to her kitchen door. She'd given the address and had not suggested meeting anywhere else, because she'd decided some time ago that showing people her actual operation rather than a version of it was more efficient. And he came in and looked around with the focused attention of someone who is assessing space, equipment, rather than making social observations. Smaller than I expected, he said. It was not an insult. It was an observation. It produces more than the size suggests, she said. Sit down. She gave him bread the current batch, plain sourdough and coffee, and she him eat the bread the way she always watched people eat her food. He ate a full slice before he said anything, which told her he was paying attention, rather than just being polite. That's very good, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. Then he smiled a real one, brief. Silas said you were direct. I don't have time not to be, she said. Tell me what you're actually looking for, he told her. Weekly delivery to the hotel bread, 6 varieties minimum, pastry for the breakfast service, pies for the dining room rotation. He had specific quantities in mind, and he named them, and she wrote them in her notebook while he talked. The contract he was envisioning was 6 months to start, renewable, with a fixed weekly price he named at the end of the specifics. She wrote that number down too. She looked at the number. She looked at the quantities. She looked at her kitchen. I can't produce that volume in my current space, she said. Not to the standard you'd need. How long would it take you to expand the operation? He said. That depends on capital, she said, which I don't currently have at the required level. He nodded slowly, as if this were expected. What would the expansion require? She told him. She'd worked through the numbers that week. She'd known this conversation was coming, and she'd prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by getting specific before emotion had a chance to get involved. New oven, additional prep table, an extra workspace in the back room she currently used for storage, and a person. She'd need to hire someone reliable. Those pieces were in place, she said. I could begin delivery in 6 weeks. And without them, I can give you half the quantity at the quality you need, she said, which is probably not what you're looking for. Whitby looked at his coffee cup, then at the bread, then at her. There's a woman in town, he said, a baker. She approached me last spring. Her product is, he paused, consistent, not exceptional. She could give me the quantity. Then why are you here? Mara said. Because consistent and exceptional are not the same thing, he said, and the Territorial Hotel's dining room cares about the difference. He set down his cup. I'm willing to wait 6 weeks for the right product. I'm not willing to wait 6 months. If you can solve the capital problem and expand the operation, I'll sign a contract today with a delayed start. If you can't, I'll go with consistent. Mara looked at her notebook. 6 weeks. The capital problem. She thought about the numbers she'd written in the separate column. She thought about what she didn't have and what it would take to get there. She thought about going to the bank. There was a small bank in the crossing now, had been for 2 years, and what a woman like her would be told by a man behind a desk who'd never seen her work. She thought about Silas Mercer. She did not want to think about Silas Mercer in this context. Give me a week, she said. I'll have an answer by next Friday. Whitby nodded, stood, buttoned his coat. 1 week, he said. The door he stopped. For what it's worth, he said. Silas Mercer told me more about your work in 20 minutes than most people could convey in an hour. He's not a man who recommends things he doesn't mean. He left. Mara sat at the table and looked at the numbers in her notebook for a long time. She went to the bank on Monday. The man behind the desk was named Carver, and he was polite in the way of people who are paid to be polite to everyone, and therefore reserve their actual opinion for when you've left the building. He listened to her, explain what she needed, the loan amount, the purpose, the repayment structure she'd worked out, And he looked at her operation summary, which she'd written out cleanly and brought with her because she knew better than to walk into a financial conversation without documentation. He looked at it the way people look at things they've already decided about before the meeting. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, in the tone that preceded a particular kind of sentence, "a woman operating a home kitchen without property collateral, beyond the homestead the bank's position on this kind of." "But what collateral would you require?" she said. She had read the words in his face before he'd finished, and she was not going to let him complete the speech because she'd heard versions of it before, and they didn't get more useful with repetition. "The homestead is 40 acres?" he said. 40 acres and a structure, she said. "Current assessed value that would support a modest loan, but the bank's lending committee would want to see. There's a process, Mrs. Bellamy, a review period, possibly 2 to 3 months before any funds. I need a decision in a week," she said. "That's not possible," he said. She picked up her papers. She drove home. In the mud, there had been a thaw and refreeze cycle that had turned the road into a particular challenge, and she sat at her table and thought about 3 months. She thought about Whitby and his 1 week and his consistent baker who could give him volume without quality. She thought about being 6 weeks from a real contract and 3 months from bank approval. Thought about how close and how far those numbers were from each other. She did not want to have the next conversation, but she had learned over 3 years, and in ways that had cost her in pride and in comfort, and sometimes in sleep, that the conversations you don't want to have are usually the ones that need having. She wrote a note and sent it to the Mercer Ranch Tuesday morning. He came Wednesday evening. She had bread on the table and coffee ready, because she'd decided there was no point in making the conversation more fraught than it already was, by not offering basic hospitality, and she had the notebook open to the numbers page, because she was not going to present this as anything other than what it was, a business proposition that required something she didn't have. She told him everything directly: Whitby, the quantities, capital requirement, the bank's timeline, the week she had left. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was done, he looked at the numbers she'd written. "How much?" he said. She told him. He nodded slowly. "I can do that," he said. "It's a loan," she said, "not a gift. I want that written down before any money changes. Hands formal terms, repayments, schedule, interest if you require it. I want it drafted by someone with legal standing, and I want a copy held by each of us." He looked at her. "I wasn't going to offer it as a gift," he said. "Good," she said, "because I wouldn't have taken it." Something moved through his expression, the particular look of a person encountering someone who has thought the thing through all the way, gone to the end. "No interest," he said. "Just repayment on whatever schedule makes sense with the contract income." "I'll set a fixed schedule," she said. "I don't want it open-ended. Open-ended creates the wrong kind of obligation." "Agreed," he said. She wrote the terms in the notebook as they discussed them. He had no objections to any of the conditions she raised, which made her slightly suspicious, and she said so. "You don't have any objections," she said. "They're all reasonable," he said. "Most people find reasonable terms they didn't propose themselves harder to accept than they expect," she said. "I'm not most people," he said. "No," she said. "I've noticed that." The agreement was drafted by week's end. She'd asked Luther Haynes, who had some legal training, to draw it up properly, and paid him for his time, and she read every clause twice before she signed. Silas signed without reading it as thoroughly as she would have liked, which she told him, and he read it again, more carefully, which satisfied her. She sent Whitby her answer on Friday, yes. 6 weeks. She hired Pia Rowan the following Monday. Pia was 22, the daughter of a homesteader family who'd come through the crossing 3 years ago and stayed. She was tall and serious with a practical intelligence that revealed itself in the way she worked rather than the way she spoke. She watched a process once, asked 1 or 2 specific questions, and then executed it correctly, which was precisely what Mara needed. She was not a trained baker. What she was, Mara decided after 4 days of working alongside her, was someone who could be trained, which was worth considerably more. The oven arrived on a Thursday, a larger cast iron range, ordered from a foundry in Cheyenne, which required 4 men and a good deal of creative language to get through the kitchen door. Mara had measured the door frame before she ordered. It fit by 2 inches. She stood and watched it go in with the focused attention of someone who had measured twice and still held their breath. Prep table went against the back wall. The storage room was cleared and reorganized. She spent 2 evenings doing it herself because she was particular about her systems and she didn't want anyone else's version of organized. And by the 3rd week of January, the kitchen looked like something categorically different from what it had been in November. Larger, yes. More equipment. But also, and this was the part she hadn't entirely anticipated, more real. Like a thing that had been trying to happen for a long time and was finally allowed to. She stood in it one morning before Pia arrived and before the bread went in, just standing in the space of it, and she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride. Something quieter. The particular quality of a long effort coming into a form that could hold it. She allowed herself 30 seconds of that. Then she started the fire. The first Whitby delivery went out on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of February. She drove the wagon herself. She'd have Pia drive eventually. But not the first time. Not the delivery that mattered. And she arrived at the Territorial Hotel in the county seat at 7 in the morning with the bread wrapped in cloth and the pies in their covered pans and the pastry packed in the insulated box she'd had made specifically for cold weather transport. The hotel kitchen manager was a red-faced man named Burrell, who had been in commercial kitchens long enough to have the skepticism of someone who'd been let down repeatedly. He opened the wrapping on the bread with the particular care of someone who expects to be disappointed. And he smelled it first, which she took as a good sign, because people who pay attention to smell before taste are paying real attention, and then he cut a heel and ate it standing there. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "When can you guarantee this weekly?" "I already can," she said. "The contract is already signed." He looked at her, then at the bread. Then he went to find a second person to come look at it, which was the particular endorsement she'd been hoping for. She drove home in the February cold feeling, something that was as close to uncomplicated satisfaction as she'd been able to get in recent memory. Not joy, she was still too careful for joy, but the deep, functional satisfaction of work that had been difficult and was now moving correctly, like a machine finally running without the particular friction that had been wrong for too long. Silas came by that evening. He'd started coming by on Tuesday evenings in a pattern that had established itself without either of them. Formally establishing it, he came. She had coffee ready. They talked about whatever was actually on their minds. He left at a reasonable hour. It was the most consistent non-business relationship she'd had since before Thomas, and she thought about it as little as she could manage, because thinking about it too directly made her careful, in ways that were starting to feel excessive, even to her. "How did it go?" he said. "Well," she said. "Well, like adequate? Or well, like the kitchen manager called a colleague in to look at the bread," she said, "which is well." He was quiet for a moment, and when she looked up, he had an expression on his face that she was starting to be able to read something between genuine pleasure for her and the specific restraint of someone who knows that certain reactions are unwelcome. He said, "The repayment starts next month," she said. "First installment as agreed." "I know," he said. "I remember what we agreed." "I know you remember. I'm telling you so we're clear." "Clear," he said, without exasperation, which she appreciated. They drank coffee. He asked about Pia. She told him about the first week of working with her, not effusively, but specifically, the way she talked about work she respected. He listened with the focused quality she'd noticed early on, the quality of someone actually storing what you say rather than waiting for their turn. He said, "At some point, you're different when you talk about the kitchen." She looked at him. "Different how?" "More," he thought about it, "present," he said. "Like you're not running the rest of your life on one part of your mind while you're talking." She thought about that. "The kitchen is the one place I've never had to manage what I look like while I'm working," she said. came out more directly than she'd intended. He looked at her. "Is that what you do everywhere else?" he said. "Everyone does it," she said. "Some people just have to do more of it than others." "And in the kitchen," he said. "In the kitchen," she said, "nobody cares what shape the cook is. They care about the food." He was quiet. She'd said more than she'd meant to, and she knew it, and she looked at her coffee cup. "I think that's wrong," he said quietly. She looked up. "That you have to manage it anywhere," he said. That's just the condition. "The reality," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I'm saying it's wrong." He wasn't arguing. He wasn't trying to fix it. He was just naming it, the way he named things plainly, without decoration. And she sat with that for a moment. She was not ready to cry about it. She was not going to cry about it. She was 34 years old, and she had spent 3 years building something out of nothing. And she was not going to cry in her own kitchen over a thing she'd known since she was 12. But she felt it. She felt it in the place where she'd gotten very good at not feeling things. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. He nodded. They moved on. He talked about the spring pasture plans. She asked a question about whether the south field drainage was going to be the problem she'd suspected from looking at the soil. They talked about that until 8:30. He left at the kitchen door. The step he stopped. "Mara," he said. She waited. "I'd like to come to the harvest supper next month,"
he said.
"the one the crossing does at the Grange Hall. As you're not as anything formal. Just." He stopped, started over. "I'd like to come with you." She looked at him in the doorway, light. He looked like someone who was not at all certain how this was going to land, which was such an unfamiliar expression on a man of his position that it almost made her say yes immediately out of the novelty of it. She didn't say yes immediately. She thought about it for a moment, about what it would mean, practically, to walk into the Grange Hall with Silas Mercer, about what the crossing would make of it, about what she would make of it, about whether she was ready for a thing that required her to make a calculation that wasn't about flour and salt, and repayment schedules. "All right," she said. He exhaled slightly. She noticed. 8 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late. I'm running the bread table, and I need to be there early." "I won't be late," he said. He went down to his horse. She watched him ride out. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he'd gone, in the cold, and she was aware of something shifting in the particular way that things shift when you've been holding very still for a long time. And finally, cautiously allow yourself one small movement. She went back inside. She had tomorrow's prep to finish, and the bread for Thursday's Hartwell delivery to start, and Pia was coming at 6, and she needed to have the cold room organized before then. Picked up her notebook. She started the list. The Grange Hall on harvest supper night smelled the way it always did, wood smoke and fried onions and the particular dusty warmth of a building that spent most of the year empty and came alive only when the community needed a reason to be in the same room together. Mara arrived at 6:30 with 24 loaves in the wagon and Pia beside her, because the bread table was her contribution to the evening. And she'd been running it for 2 years and had a system. They unloaded in the side entrance, arranged the loaves on the long table against the west wall, and Mara stood back and looked at the arrangement with the critical attention she gave everything she presented publicly. "The sourdough in front," she said. "The rye to the left. People reach for what's closest, and the sourdough goes faster." "I know," Pia said. She'd been told this before. She rearranged without comment. People began arriving at 7. The hall filled in the particular way of small community gatherings, gradually. And then all at once, the noise rising, the temperature increasing from the bodies and the 2 wood stoves at either end. Mara stayed at the bread table for the first 30 minutes, cutting samples, answering questions, watching the loaves go with the satisfaction of someone who has calibrated supply to demand correctly. Clara Dunn materialized at her elbow sometime around 7:20. "He's here," Clara said. "Who?" Mara said, which was not entirely honest but bought her a moment. "Don't," Clara said. She was smiling in the particular way of a woman who has been waiting several months for something to become interesting. He came through the door 5 minutes ago, and he's talking to the Hartwell men near the stove, and he's been looking over here twice already. Clara, Mara said. I'm just reporting what I see, Clara said. Go eat something, Mara said. Clara went, still smiling. Silas found his way to the bread table at 7:40, which was, she noted, without letting herself feel anything complicated about it, almost exactly 8 o'clock, minus the 20 minutes she'd been there early. He was not dressed formally. He was dressed like a man who'd put thought into, not looking like he'd put thought into it, which was its own kind of information. You're early, she said. You said 8, he said. It's nearly 8, I said. Don't be late. I didn't say come exactly on time. Those mean the same thing, he said. They don't, she said, but never mind. She handed him a slice of the sourdough. Try it. Tell me if the crust is right. I adjusted the steam in the last batch, and I want a second opinion. He ate the bread with the attention she'd come to expect from him, not performing appreciation, just actually tasting it. The crust is right, he said. Good, she said. Now go talk to someone. I'm working. He did. She watched Tim move into the room from the corner of her eye and thought about nothing in particular. She was lying to herself, which she permitted on a limited basis. Evening moved the way those evenings move food and talking, and the particular catching up that happens when people who see each other regularly nonetheless find new things to say when they're in the same room with fiddle music and cider. Mara worked the bread table until the loaves were mostly gone, then handed the remainder to Pia and moved into the room. She talked to Agnes, who had come with her sister. She talked to Mrs. Osgood from the judge's household, who told her in her brisk, specific way that the judge had mentioned the meals twice in the past month to 2 different county officials, and that Mara should expect inquiries. She talked to Hector Sloan, who'd fixed her roof, and who told her the ridge was holding well through the freeze-thaw cycle, which she was glad to hear. At some point, Silas was beside her, not dramatically, just present, in the way he'd become present in the margins of her life, steady and non-intrusive. They talked to people together, which was its own kind of thing. The first time they'd been in a public room together, in a context that wasn't professional. She noticed the noticing of others, the particular quality of attention that moves through a small community when something has shifted, and she didn't perform indifference to it, but she also didn't perform anything else. Later, when the fiddle had started and people had moved the tables to make room, they stood near the back wall with cider, and she said, "People are staring." And "Yes," he said. "Does that bother you?" She said. He looked at her directly. "Does it bother you?" He said. She thought about it, honestly, which took a moment. "It used to bother me when they were staring at me. For the wrong reasons," she said. "This is different." "How is it different?" "Because this time I know exactly what they're looking at," she said. And I decided to let them. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most direct thing you've ever said to me." "I'm always direct," she said. "About work," he said. "About other things you're very careful." She looked at her cider. "Yes," she said. "I am, I know," he said, not as criticism, just acknowledgement. They stayed until 9:30, which was longer than she'd planned. She drove home with Pia, who was quiet in the comfortable way of someone who doesn't need to fill silence. And Mara sat on the wagon seat and looked at the road ahead and thought about the evening, not exhaustively, not with the particular analytical attention she gave problems, but in the loose way of something she was letting settle rather than examining. She was happy. It was such an unfamiliar condition that she noted it with a kind of suspicion. The way you note unexpected good weather in Wyoming knowing the next day will prove something. March came. The repayment installments to Silas went out correctly and on time, and she kept the record in the notebook and gave him a copy each month, which he accepted without making it into anything more than what it was. A business transaction between 2 people who had agreed to terms and were honoring them. She valued this more than she could easily explain. The Whitby contract renewed at the end of the first 6 months, as she'd hoped, and the renewed terms were slightly better than the original, more volume, marginally better per unit price, an expanded pastry order. Burrell, the kitchen manager, had stopped looking at her deliveries with the skepticism of a man expecting disappointment. He'd started looking at them the way people look at things they've come to rely on. She hired a second helper in April, a woman named Ruth, older, experienced in bulk cooking if not in baking. Ruth was opinionated and occasionally wrong about technique and took correction badly the first for 2 times before she settled, and Mara decided after the third week that the friction was worth the capacity Ruth brought to the operation. Kitchen was running 3 days a week at full capacity. She was delivering to the hotel, to the judge's household, to 4 regular families in the crossing, and to the Grange itself for its monthly meetings. It was not wealthy, but the arithmetic in the notebook looked like something she had never seen it look like before. Not survival math, not even adequate math, but the math of a business that was, by any honest measure, working. Thought about her mother. The recipe book that still sat on the kitchen shelf, she didn't need it anymore, hadn't needed it for a year, but she kept it there because some things earn their place by what they represent rather than what they're currently useful for. Her mother had written those recipes in the careful small hand of a woman who couldn't afford to waste paper, carried them from Georgia through years of hard country, had set them down in a water-stained journal, and kept that journal even when it was one more thing to transport. She'd never told Mara directly that the recipes were anything other than practical. But she taught Tamara how to make the sourdough starter at 11 years old and said, while she was teaching her, "This is something nobody can take from you if you keep it working," which was as close to philosophy as her mother ever got, and which Mara had been thinking about, off and on, for 23 years. You keep it working, through the bad seasons and the cold mornings, and the years when it barely holds, and the weeks when you're not sure it's going to hold at all. You feed it, and you tend it, and you don't let it die, and one day it becomes something nobody can reasonably call fragile anymore. She was tending it. Silas came on Tuesdays, mostly, sometimes Thursdays. The visits had a shape to them. Now coffee, real conversation, the particular back and forth of 2 people who have gotten past the stage of presenting versions of themselves and have started just talking. They disagreed about things. Not performatively. She didn't argue for the sake of it, and neither did he, but genuinely, with the friction that comes from 2 people who both have considered opinions about practical matters. He thought she was underselling herself on the crossing accounts. She thought he was miscalculating the risk on his spring cattle purchase. They were each partially right, which neither of them admitted directly, but both of them adjusted for, which was its own kind of communication. In May, he came on a Wednesday instead of Tuesday. She noticed the variation without commenting on it. He came in, sat down, accepted coffee, and was quieter than usual. She let it sit for a while because she'd learned that Silas processed things before he said them, which was a quality she respected even when it made a conversation slower than she'd prefer. "There's something I want to ask you," he said eventually. She waited. "And I want to ask it correctly," he said. "So I'm going to take a minute." "Take the minute," she said. He looked at his hands, then at the bread on the rack, then at her. "I'm not going to talk about how I feel," he said, "because that's not how we talk to each other, and I don't want to start now, but I'm going to tell you what I know." She was very still. "I know that the best part of any week I've had since November is Tuesday evening," he said. "I know that when something happens, something real, something that matters, you're the first person I think of telling. I know that I respect you more than I've respected most people in my life, and that that's not separate from the other thing. It's the same thing." He paused. "And I know that you've been alone for a long time, and that some of that alone was chosen, and some of it wasn't, and that I'm not going to pretend I can walk in here and make either of those things simple." She did not say anything. "But I would like to," he said. "Try. With you. If you're willing to tell me what that would need to look like." Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the May wind was doing what it did the Wyoming wind that came across the flats with a particular persistence, finding every gap. She'd gotten the windows recalked in March, and they held better now, but she could still hear it. She thought about Thomas. She thought about what it had cost her to build something after he was gone, Not just the work of it, but the particular cost of learning to want things again, which was harder than people who hadn't lost imagined. She thought about Vivian Whitlock, which was not obvious but connected about the kind of life that organizes itself around being received a certain way. And what happens when the reception fails? She thought about herself at 4 in the morning, in a kitchen that wasn't hers, working by lamplight while a house full of guests slept, and whether she had ever really believed that someone would say her name the right way in a room full of people. "You'd have to be patient," she said. "I'm not," she stopped. "I don't know how to do this anymore. I did once, and then I didn't have to for a long time, and I'm not sure what's still there." "That's all right," he said. "I mean actually patient," she said. "Not patient like a person who's waiting for something to shift. Patient like someone who understands this is just how it goes." "I understand," he said. "You think you understand," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I'd rather find out I was wrong about it than not try." She looked at him. He looked back at her, without flinching and without performing, which was she had come to understand the thing about him that was most difficult to argue with. He didn't dress things up. He didn't need her to be easier or simpler or smaller, to fit whatever he'd been expecting. He'd been sitting in her kitchen for 6 months, watching her be exactly who she was, and he kept coming back. "All right," she said. He exhaled. "Don't do that," she said. "What?" "Look relieved. Like I might have said no and you weren't sure." "I wasn't sure," he said. "You should have been sure," she said. "I've been making you coffee for 6 months." Something crossed his face, not a smile exactly, but something in the neighborhood of one, real and unguarded. "I thought the coffee was hospitality," he said. "It was," she said. "But I don't make coffee for people I want to leave." They sat with that for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They drank their coffee. Summer came to the crossing, with the particular quality of Wyoming summers, short and brilliant, and requiring immediate use because it would not last. Kitchen ran at full capacity through June and July, because the hotel dining room was at its busiest, and Burrell had added a summer special to the menu that required a specific flatbread she'd developed for him in April, and he wanted it twice weekly instead of once. She and Pia and Ruth worked mornings in a rotation that had found its rhythm, and the kitchen, that had once been a room in a struggling homestead, was now, by any honest assessment, a real operation. She and Silas walked in the evening, sometimes not always, not on a schedule. But when the day had been long and the weather permitted, they walked her property line and sometimes onto the road that ran toward the Mercer land, talking about whatever was actually on their minds. It was not romantic in the way of stories, or not only that it was two people learning each other in the practical, textured way that has more to do with how someone responds to frustration or tiredness or an unexpected problem than with any particular moment. He got frustrated. She saw it twice, once over a fence dispute with a neighbor and once over a purchasing decision he'd made that hadn't worked out. And both times he went quiet rather than loud about it, which was a thing she noted carefully. She got impatient. He saw it. She knew he saw it because she watched him adjust his timing on 2 separate occasions when she was deep in a problem, giving her the space she needed without being told. She noticed that too. They were not perfect together, because there is no such thing, and because two people who have both been shaped by loss and difficulty bring that shaping into relationship the way they bring everything else embedded, not separate, but they were real. She thought that was worth more. In September, Whitby came through the crossing for a meeting about the contract renewal and asked to visit the kitchen, in which she permitted. He walked through it with the same assessing look as the first time, and she watched him do the recalibration she'd seen before the adjustment of expectation upward. "You've grown it considerably," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have an additional proposal," he said. He explained it, not a supply arrangement, but a consulting arrangement. A request for her to advise on the hotel kitchen's bread operation for a quarter, working with their on-site baker to improve their in-house production. The hotel would pay her a separate consulting fee on top of the supply contract. She looked at him. "That's not what I do," she said. "What you're capable of," he said. Those aren't always the same thing, she said. But she wrote the number down and told him she'd think about it, because she'd learned that the value of immediate refusal was frequently less than it felt in the moment. She thought about it for 3 days. She talked to Pia, because Pia's opinion on what the kitchen could handle without her was relevant. She talked to Ruth, because Ruth's opinion on her own readiness to take more responsibility was relevant. She did not talk to Silas, because it was her business and her decision, and those were not the same thing as his concern, and she was clear about that distinction. She accepted the consulting arrangement on a Thursday and wrote the terms herself, which Whitby's attorney accepted, with only one minor modification she approved. She told Silas about it on Tuesday evening. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel about it?" he said. "I feel like it's the thing I should do," she said, "which is how I feel about most things I've decided to do." "That's not the same as wanting to do it," he said. "Thought about that." "I want to do it," she said. "I'm also afraid of it, which is different from not wanting it." "What are you afraid of, that I'll be somewhere I don't belong?" she said. Came out plainly, which surprised her. "A hotel kitchen in the county seat, advising people who've been in commercial kitchens longer than I have. They'll look at me and—" She stopped. "And see what?" he said quietly. She looked at her hands. "The same thing people always see first," she said. He didn't try to argue her out of it, or tell her she was wrong to feel it, or perform the particular comfort that tells a person their feeling is being managed rather than heard. He just sat with it. Then he said, "You walked into that hall in November, in a kitchen apron, with flour on your sleeve, in front of 200 people who hadn't earned the right to look at you. Say anything. You can walk into a hotel kitchen," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most direct thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I'm always direct," he said. She almost laughed. It was close enough to laughter that it counted. October came. The consulting arrangement was harder than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which was the shape of most things she'd been afraid of. The hotel kitchen staff were skeptical, and then less skeptical, and then, by the 4th week, receptive in the way of people who have decided that the thing they were resisting is actually useful. She drove to the county seat on Mondays for the quarter, which was long and tiring, and she came home Mondays feeling like she'd been pulled in 7 directions. And Tuesdays she was in her own kitchen before 5, because the supply deliveries didn't pause for her consulting schedule. She was tired in a way she hadn't been since the Mercer wedding week. But the tired felt different, less like survival, and more like the cost of building something that was actually going somewhere. November came. A year since the wedding. She was in her kitchen on a Saturday morning when she registered the anniversary not planned. Just a sudden awareness that the calendar had come back around to the same point. She was standing at the work table with her hands in dough, and she thought, a year. She thought about the woman who had driven to the Merce Ranch on a Wednesday morning with her knives and her mother's recipe book and $40 waiting at the end of it, who had stood very still when Vivienne Whitlock pressed one gloved finger against her chest and said what she said, who had rebuilt a leaking roof and shod an old horse and ordered flour and started again. She thought about all the mornings before that she'd counted against the arithmetic of survival, the particular discipline of not letting herself want more than the arithmetic could support. She was not the same woman. Not better, exactly. She didn't think of it in those terms, because better implied there had been something wrong with who she was. At any of those points, and she knew better than that now, she was the same woman with more of herself visible, with less of herself arranged in defensive positions, with a kitchen that was a real business, and accounts that weren't survival math, and a man who sat at her table on Tuesdays and knew what the difference between left serve and right serve meant, and had never once, not once, looked at her the way Vivienne Whitlock had looked at her in the doorway of that cold room. Kept working the dough. Silas came by that evening. He sat at the table while she finished cleaning up, and she made coffee, and there was a particular quality to the silence in the kitchen that told her something was different tonight. She had learned to read the quality of his silences, the way she read the oven's temperature, by feel rather than by instrument. "There's something on the table," he said. She looked. There was an envelope she hadn't noticed. He'd put it there while she had her back turned. She looked at him. "Open it," he said. She picked up the envelope. Inside was a single folded page. The loan agreement, the one Luther Haynes had drafted in January with both their signatures. She unfolded it and looked at it. Across the face of it, in Silas's deliberate handwriting, "Paid in full," and below that the date. She looked up. "I calculated it this week," he said. "With the interest you insisted on adding, even though I said no interest. You've overpaid slightly. I owe you." "You're not serious," she said. "By my calculation, $6.40, he said. She looked at the paper. She had not expected to feel what she felt. She had thought, when she thought about the repayment finishing, which she had, on occasion, let herself imagine that it would feel like relief, clearing. It felt like something larger than that, like the last external claim on what she'd built releasing its hold, and the building was entirely hers now, not contingent on anyone or any arrangement, simply hers, in the way of something you've made with your own hands from whatever you had available. She set the paper down. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. He had something in his hand that she hadn't noticed, a small plain object, the kind of small that doesn't announce itself. He set it on the table between them. A ring. Simple gold. Not elaborate. The kind of thing chosen by someone who understood that she would not want elaborate. She looked at it, then at him. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said, "because you'd find it irritating, and then I'd have to overcome the irritation before you could answer, and I don't want to create obstacles." He paused. "I want to marry you. I want to do it because you're the person I want to be in a room with for the rest of my life, and because you're going to keep building something worth being near, and because I would like to be near it, near you." He looked at her steadily. "That's all of it." She looked at the ring on the table. She thought about the last time she'd worn a ring, Thomas's ring, which she'd put away in a box in the back room after the first year. Not from grief exactly, but from the particular honesty of acknowledging that carrying it on her hand was not useful to either of them anymore. She thought about what it had cost her to build a life that was hers. The mornings before 4, the mud on the wheels, the flour that ran low, and the roof that leaked, and the account at Luther Haynes's store she'd managed against the arithmetic of what she could afford. The 3 years of learning what she was capable of in the specific, unglamorous daily way that you only learn things that actually get into you. She thought about what she was afraid of. She thought about walking into the hotel kitchen afraid and doing it anyway. She thought about the hall at the Mercer Ranch, standing in the door of it in a kitchen apron, with flour on her sleeve, and 200 people turning to look, and Silas saying her name in the flat, carrying voice of a man who meant it. Mara Bellamy. She thought about who that woman was now. Not the woman people had overlooked, or not only that, the woman who had stayed in the room, who had corrected the bottom tier and hidden the repair so well that nobody who hadn't built it would ever know, who had stood still when someone tried to make her smaller, and then, when the moment required it, refused to leave. Picked up the ring. "Yes," she said. He breathed. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said. You looked relieved again. "I was uncertain again," he said. "You should stop being uncertain," she said. "I've been making you coffee for a year." The wedding was in April, which gave the ground time to be reliable, and gave Mara time to finish the consulting quarter and begin the spring supply schedule without disruption. She was not going to let a wedding upend the arithmetic. He understood this and did not suggest otherwise, which remained one of his better qualities. They married in the Crossing's old Grange Hall, the same hall where they'd stood against the back wall with cider, the same room where she'd run the bread table for 2 years. 23 people. Agnes came, and Clara Dunn and Mrs. Osgood and Pia and Ruth, and Clement, who had turned 16 and grown an additional 2 inches, and still had the fundamental goodwill intact, and Hector Sloane, who had fixed her roof, and Judge Alderman, which was not something she'd expected, and which told her something about how far the arithmetic had traveled. She wore her mother's apron beneath her dress, not over it, beneath it, tied at her waist under the fabric, invisible to everyone in the room. She'd washed and mended it carefully the night before. The stain near the pocket was still there, the one from Thursday's stock that terrible November week. The frayed edge she'd mended twice, and it held. She stood at the front of the hall, and she was aware of the apron the way you're aware of something that belongs against your skin present. Grounding, a reminder that moved with her. Her mother had worn it in a kitchen in Georgia, had brought it west, had set it down on a table one day and not picked it up again, and Mara had folded it and kept it, and one morning taken it out and tied it on because she needed to do something with her hands. And from that morning forward, it had been with her through every version of the life she'd built. Some things earn their place by what they represent rather than what they're currently useful for. Silas stood beside her and said the simple, honest words of the ceremony in the flat, carrying voice she'd come to know as his, and she said hers without wavering. And when it was done, Agnes started the applause. And it was nothing like the applause in the Mercer Hall. It was 23 people in a building that smelled like wood smoke, people who actually knew her, and it was better by every measure she had. Clara Dunn cried. Mara had expected this. Agnes did not cry. Mara had expected this too. Clement knocked over a chair on the way to the food table and then looked mortified. Some things were constant, and constants were their own kind of comfort. There are things the stories about women like Mara get wrong. They get wrong the idea that recognition is the ending, that the moment the room turns and says your name correctly is the destination, the resolution, the thing everything was building toward. That once you've been seen, the work is done. It isn't. The work, the morning after the wedding, was the same work as every other morning. There was a delivery due Tuesday and prep that couldn't wait, and Pia coming at 6 with a question about the new flatbread specification. The arithmetic in the notebook was better than it had ever been, but it was still arithmetic, still the daily management of a real thing that required real attention. What had changed was not the work. What had changed was what the work meant, not in some large proclaimed way, in the small daily way of a person who has stopped spending half their energy managing the fear that it will all collapse, who has stopped calculating survival and started calculating growth with something like genuine expectation that it will hold. Mara had spent 3 years learning what she was made of. She had not learned it in the moment the room applauded. She had learned it at 4 a.m. with flour on her hands and a bottom tier that had listed to the left and a flat knife and the particular focused patience of someone who knows that most problems have solutions if you're willing to be precise about them. She had learned it in the years before, that in the arithmetic of survival, in the exhausted mornings, in the mud on the wheels coming home in the dark. She had been learning it her whole life, in every kitchen she'd stood in, starting with her mother's. The woman who had been told she was too much, too big, too poor, too ordinary, to be seen had not become worthy by becoming smaller. She had simply stayed in the room. She had kept the starter working through every cold season. And one morning she had looked up from the work table, and the room was full of work that mattered, and people who knew her, and a life that was, by any honest measure, built on terms she had written herself. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what it did, arriving late and cold, and then suddenly, fiercely present, the land going from brown to green in the particular urgent way of places where the season is short and every day of it counts. She had 12 loaves in the oven and a delivery to plan and a notebook open to next week's column. She picked up her pencil. She started the list.